Welcome to another edition of Bible Time. This is the Thursday edition of the Believers Fellowship Daily Bible Reading. And this certainly has been an interesting week for those of us living in and around the San Antonio area. And it's given us a good opportunity to think through some things carefully and to reflect on the Lord and what He has to say and what He has done. And these two Psalms that we're going to look at today really provide us with a great opportunity to do that, to look at some historical perspective on the works of God that I think will be helpful for us as we apply that to our situation right here, right now, today. Psalms 105 and 106. Psalm 105 starts off by saying, "Give thanks, sing praise to the Lord, glory in His holy name." And why? Verse 5, "Remember the wondrous works He has done." And then basically he launches off into the Abrahamic covenant, the covenant that he made with Abraham. He swore to Isaac and he confirmed with Jacob about a land and a people that he would give to them. And then it goes on to talk about what he did in bringing this all about. And that's the thing that's highlighted in this psalm. It's what God did, what he did. Verse 16, when he summoned a famine on the land, he summoned a famine on the land of Israel. He had sent a man ahead of them. He did it. God sent a man. That's a reference to Joseph. He had sent him down into Egypt, preparing the way for when this famine came on the land. God directly did that. We think his brothers sold him into slavery, and that certainly was part of it, but that was God working to bring that about. And then look at what he did in Egypt. It said the Lord made his people very fruitful, verse 24, and verse 25, he turned their hearts, the Egyptians, start to hate his people, to deal craftily with his servants. God caused that to happen. And so that led to, verse 26, he sent Moses. And then verse 28, he sent darkness. And verse 29, he turned their waters into blood. Verse 31, he spoke and there were swarms of flies. Verse 32, he gave them hail for rain. Verse 33, he struck down their vines and fig trees. Verse 34, he spoke and the locusts came. Verse 36, he struck down all the firstborn of their land. As God brings these plagues, he first of all, he stirs up the hatred for his people, and then he brings all of these plagues on Egypt. And the end result is, verse 37, then he brought out Israel with silver and gold. And he was doing all of that so that Israel would leave, Egypt would want them to leave, and Egypt would give them things to make them go. And he brought them, and then it goes on to talk about how he brought them through the wilderness, and how he provided for them in every way, and then he brought them into the land. And it closes with, praise the Lord. Let's just think about what God has done, and let's praise the Lord and think about how active and how sovereign he is in all of the events of the world. Not just the events related to his people, but because he is working all things through all people for his purposes. And we can be sure of that here today. That the situation that we're in, it didn't catch God by surprise, and God is working all of these things for his purposes. Let's praise the Lord, and let's think about, remember all the wondrous deeds he's done, and to think about what he could do even through these difficult times. And that brings us to Psalm 106, which reminds us that God is faithful even when his people are unfaithful, because we just read about all the things that God did, but in the midst of all of that, a large percentage of his people, the people of Israel, were being unfaithful. But God's steadfast love endures forever. And he asks the Lord, because they're suffering now the consequences of all their unfaithfulness, he asks the Lord in verse 4, "Remember me, O Lord, when you show favor to your people. Help me when you save them." See, there's a covenant. God's steadfast love endures forever. God's going to fulfill that covenant. And so even though they may be suffering now because of their sin, he knows that there's coming a day, God's going to keep his promise. A Messiah is going to come. We're going to be in the land, and it's all going to be there, and he's wanting to be saved by God when that happens. Remember me. And notice that when he prays this now, he includes himself in the prayer. This is a common thing that you see in the Bible, where he says in verse 6, "Both we and our fathers have sinned. We have committed iniquity. We have done wickedness. So he includes himself. He's humble. He recognizes they're getting what they deserve. And he's looking forward to that day of salvation and wanting God to remember him in that day of salvation. And so you can read the psalm. It's a long chronicle of all of their failures from Egypt into the land, all their sins in the land, and then God gave them into the hands of the nations. You can read all of that. It's all history there in this psalm, Psalm 106. But look at how it comes to an end. Look at verse 44. It says, "Nevertheless, he, God, looked upon their distress when he heard their cry. For their sake he remembered his covenant and relented according to the abundance of his steadfast love. He caused them to be pitied by all who held them captive." God, they've been unfaithful to him. God's brought judgment upon them, but God hasn't forgotten them, and God hasn't forgotten his promises to them. And verse 47, "Save us, O Lord our God, and gather us from among the nations, that we may give thanks to your holy name and glory in your praise." He still knows that that's going to happen because God's going to be faithful to his promises. And that's something for you and me to look at too. I mean, God has been faithful. God has kept his word. God is at work in the world, and he has a glorious future in mind. The Messiah is going to come. There is going to be a kingdom. Jesus is going to rule on this earth. And we just want to be faithful right now and be remembered by God in that kingdom. So these are things to encourage us as we think about the events going on in our day and think about how God is in control of all these things. He's fulfilling his purposes. His promises are for sure. His steadfast love endures forever. Praise the Lord. We'll see you tomorrow for more Bible time.